coming. Also, welcome to the people following the session via streaming. Thanks to the Committee of Ethics of the University for organizing this session. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Miquel-Àngel Serra holds a PhD in biology from the Universitat Autònoma, and his original research area is in biomedicine. Later on, he joined the neuropharmacology lab at UPF, or Pompeu Fabra. Later on, he became a scientific researcher at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission in Ispra, in Italy, until 2002. Then he came back to Barcelona and was the Dean of the Healthcare Sciences Faculty of Universitat Internacional de Catalunya until 2005. And currently he is a scientific collaborator at Pompeu Fabra, and now his main job is he is back in working in the Joint Research Center of the European Commission as scientific researcher since 2020. Apart from many scientific publications, he authored a well-known book about humans or post-humans, technological singularity, human enhancement, some of them in Spanish, or there are perhaps some of you had the opportunity to read some of these books. Today, thank you for coming and for spending some time with us, because I know that you are spending a few days in Barcelona and you are going back to Italy. So thank you very much for coming and giving us this talk.
Well, can you hear me? So thank you, Jordi. Thank you, UPC, for inviting me today, as they did last year. However, last year was on remote. Today is in presence, which is an exception for us, and it's a pleasure to see human beings in the room. First of all, I have to apologize for the delay. Whenever I come to Barcelona, I have some admin duties to clear, and today I had to renew my ID, such as any of you, okay? So there was a long queue there. Nevertheless, today we are again facing the ethical challenges of emerging technologies, as it is written in the title of the talk. And I think that whichever area of research you are interested in, you will find liaisons, you will find connections that could allow you to think critically and to act responsibly in the future, in your future life, if you are in academia or if you are in the industry. Okay, so let's start with the index. I will be more or less following. First, addressing what's human enhancement, HE, which are those so-called emerging technologies we are, or we could be concerned about, or we are delighted to have in our hands. Then I will underline one of these emerging technologies, which is genome editing, or as we say in biology, genome modification, or genome engineering. I don't know if any of you is an engineer, but we have taken this word from you and translated it into biomedicine. But what we mean is to modify nucleic acids, okay? With several, let's say, aspects, eugenics, how we get here towards genome editing. What does it mean to engineerize the germline cells? What is genetic enhancement, and which is the impact of it, with some conclusions. So the first thing, let's ground ourselves on reality. And these days, these are the top 10 causes of death. Left-hand side, low-income countries. Right-hand side, high-income countries. As you can see, many of the top 10 causes of death in the left are, let's say, avoidable conditions, avoidable diseases, which are not appearing on top on the right-hand side. So this speaks that there are inequalities, imbalances in how we see health as a global issue, and that we have a lot of things to do, because lower respiratory infections are treated, you would say, with antibiotics or with oxygen supply and so on. But if you remember well, at the beginning of the pandemics, the COVID pandemics, we ran out of oxygen, not oxygen as a gas, but just of oxygen apparatus to allow people to breathe when they had this lower pulmonary capacity. So this happens more often in low-income countries, okay? Like it happened here during certain months of the pandemics, just to ground ourselves on Earth, okay? But not only this. These are the number of people in millions that are needing an essential health service. So you can see sanitation, water clothes, toilets, restrooms. You see, it's amazingly higher, the number of people, okay? 1,000 million people, so 1 billion people. Control, hypertension control. You go to the pharmacy here and you get hypertension control, sometimes by free. Tobacco control, just know the tobacco is one of the leading causes of lung cancer, for instance. Okay? Insecticide-treated nets for allowing the infection of parasite-borne diseases. So those conditions are extremely prevalent in the world, and they deserve also our attention, not only the most sophisticated techniques applied to the most rare diseases, which of course merit also our attention. Just to also to give some data, the so-called Spanish flu, which was not Spanish, as you know very well, was coming from the east through the United States, to the soldiers that were coming to fight for the First World War, was infecting 500 million people and killed 10% of those, 50 million, okay? More than the First World War itself did. The COVID-19, 161 million people have developed the disease, have been infected, well, who knows, no? But the number of deaths officially is 5 million. But the unofficial one, the one that is being calculated by the excess of deaths with respect to last year statistically, and this you have a very good group in UPC working on that. I think it's on the other side of the diagonal, if I'm not incorrect. So there are 50 million for the time being. These data are, I think it's the end of April 30th. Okay, so these are some data that will allow us to, when we take a decision, that we act responsibly, okay? Which are our bioethics challenges in the third millennium? In order to tackle those challenges, there are many, of course, many frames, many philosophical or ethical frames we can have our attention on. This is the principalist approach, which is very practical. It gives you some, let's say, practical sense of what is the problem about, how it can be studied, how it can be dealt with, and so on. First one, respect for autonomy. So respect the decision making by the subject. This, if you are suffering or about to be operated by a surgeon, you're going to be asked if you would like to or not. So some people would prefer not to be operated and to be left as they are and be treated by another, let's say, approach. Okay? The way this is being, let's say, handled is to the informed consent. I think many of you have signed informed consents when you have had blood extraction, for instance. Okay? Beneficence, okay? You have to look for the goodness of the subject that is under treatment, okay? And not only him or her, but also the population that could be connected with him. This is, for instance, one of the principles applied to vaccination, global vaccination. Because if you get the vaccine, you're protecting yourself, and maybe, we have to demonstrate that, you are also protecting others, okay? So this is beneficence, individual and global. Non-maleficence is the contrary. So not to do something that is harmful. Okay? Before applying a therapy, any intervention, be sure that it's not going to be worse than the present status of the individual. And then justice, distributing benefits. So again, vaccination, global action, initiatives to allow vaccines to reach all the world. Okay? So these are very, very handy principles that could allow us to work out in a particular problem a reasonable solution. Okay, then the subject, this human being. What is a human being? Is a particular living organism with self-consciousness in space and time, which is a unique feature of human beings. This is particularly connected to brain evolution, which is allowing the evolving human being to acquire new capabilities. Also to use these capabilities in connection with others to, in a cooperative manner, to drive success, and then to build up human societies. And also to modify the environment. So when they were finding a river, they were looking how to cross the river. There was a primigenius engineer who built a bridge. Okay? So these type of things. But there are specificities in our brain. So this is a very intriguing area of knowledge. And I will just give you a taste of some particularities, some singularities of the brain and mental human being, which is, of course, supported by the complex structures and functions derived from the evolutionary process. First, the genetic level, which we have, for instance, particular DNA repair and brain size regulators. The acronyms are the names of the genes. I mean, it's not relevant now. The proliferation of neural precursors, neural tube, learning, memory, neurotransmitters, taxilin beta and syntabulin, an increased expression of astrocyte-associated genes, which is particular to humans with respect to chimpanzees, for instance, the areas that control language, and lost genes we don't need any longer. We don't need to chew as chimpanzees or gorillas do. We have other ways. Anatomical, there's a major complexity. You can see, for instance, the number of cortical layers, so layers that are in the cortex, which is the most above part of our brain, are 2 in amphibians, 6 in primates, but 9 in human beings. Okay, we have mirror neurons, very well-known mirror neurons, an increased amount in quantity and quality of glial cells, which have a key role also in many of our functions and diseases, and the characteristic areas of language, which are, you know very well, Wernicke and Broca in the right hemisphere. Okay, these are just some examples of what makes us singulars, okay? And this human being is not, let's say, satisfied sometimes or very often with his, her present status and refuses to be what he is. This is what Camus said in his book, The Rebel. And this reaction, this way of being is boosting the evolutionary process in a way that is not seen in other species, and that allow us going out of Africa and colonizing all the world, and with very, very good success, because we adapted to many different environments. So this speaks in favor of this evolutionary success due to non-conformity. But at the same time, there was also this desire of improvement, of amelioration. This was already present in classical Greece, and as Plato showed in the Republic, the eugenic policy is not only Sparta, as is very well known in the films and the literature, but also in the cultural Athens. Okay, so this there was a proposal. I mean, it was not carried out because they did not have the knowledge, but at least it was the idea. So this aspiration then is intrinsic to our nature and is driving us to many discoveries, to many inventions, as are written here, but also to the transmission of this new knowledge to the next generations. This is very important, because otherwise things would end buried and not useless. Okay, and this you have not only tangible things, as fire or the wheel or so, but also intangibles as language, art, or religion. But sometimes human beings are still unsatisfied. They have this Promethean envy. They want to keep up, not with the Jonases, but with the technology. And so they want to use these new inventions to transform themselves in order to be as good as the machines created by humans. And so we come to this human enhancement, which is very widespread in the world today, and which is the attempt to adopt these transient or permanent improvements as changes in the organic or functional current conditions of human beings. And we can use particularly artificial technologies. And some of these technologies are already here, or are being developed, or there are still to come. And of course, we can answer ourselves, which are the advantages? So remember the principles. Are they going to drive us to something positive, better, or not? Are they going to be available to everybody? Justice, okay? Which are the risks? Non-maleficence. Are they going to put us unexpected risks? And are they known enough by the society so that everybody could manifest their informed consent, either in a standard or non-standard manner? Okay? And what is transhumanism? We're not talking just about human enhancement. There is an ideology. This ideology has a global vision of man and nature, and it's supported in the so-called three pillars: super intelligence, super well-being, and super longevity. So the transhumanism, which is a very widespread ideology, was born in Anglo-Saxon countries, but is also present now in other countries as well. They have a program of human transformation. So they want to use artificial technologies, the so-called emerging technologies, to transform us into transhumans and to reach to be posthumans. And one of the main, let's say, milestones, according to Kurzweil, is the singularity, or the technological singularity, which is a turning point, which is going to leave us in the moment where artificial intelligence will supersede the human intelligence. So this was due when he published his book, Singularity is Near, is 2043, if I remember well. So we are almost there. Okay. So Humanity Plus, their webpage, don't limit your challenges, challenge your limits. Okay, this is very nice, but then we have to see which are the drawbacks for that, okay? Not only that we are being transformed, but we are being transformed in a way that our dignity is preserved, as we will see. Technologies, which are those emerging technologies? This is a special issue of Nature. It's from 2016, but it's still valid today. They were examining tomorrow's world, the world we are going to pass over to future generations. And these technologies were very well cartoonized, let's say, in the NBIC by the cartoonist of Nature, Wes Fernandez. And you can see that we have a lot of things that are very familiar to you, such as computing power, big data, communication speed. And indeed, we have very powerful computers. This one is over here across the street, I think. We have big data which is allowing us to collect all type of data, to use them in order to get information, for instance, health information, your blood pressure, or the oxygen concentration in your blood, or whatever biomarker, for instance, glucose, as this contact lens is providing, or whatever thing you can imagine from chips you can wear or you can have inserted in your body. So in order to use this data, they have to be systematized, then they can be shared, then they can be used for preventive medicine, but always in order to respect the rights of patients, you have to have your control of your data. Okay? In this manner, personalized or precision medicine can be carried out. But if they are not, then we come to the big business of the big data companies, the so-called GAFAM, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. Even if they change names, they're still the same, okay? And I know that a couple of them have changed names, but you know, GAFAM is very, let's say, acoustic, okay? And, okay, so they are the owners. They are our owners. They own us because I defy anyone in the room. They don't have a mobile phone, a cell phone that is either connected to Apple or to Microsoft. It's not supported by Android. I mean, we all are there. I mean, they all know where we are, what we did yesterday, and more or less what we are going to do tomorrow. Okay. So this is very intriguing and very risky. So we have all these devices that are governed by this optical fiber, broadband, wireless connections. We can't live with them. We can't, virtually. Other technologies, other NBIC technologies, Internet of Things, we're talking devices, biology, 3D, and robots. Okay? You have these tattoos, which are providing not only aesthetics, but something else. There are functions you don't have before. You can have a compass. You can have these NFC built-in capabilities in these chips that are allowing you to open a door, to pay your bill in the restaurant, the cafeteria, open the door of your house without using your keys, and so on and so forth. Epicenter is a company. The mobile phone in your head, RFID microchips. But you do have some examples. This guy, Neil Harbison, he lives in Barcelona. He's the first cyborg officially recognized by the UK Her Gracious Queen government. And in his passport, he's wearing this antenna. He's blind for colors, and this antenna is transforming colors into sounds in his brain so he can hear the colors, but more colors than the ones we can actually perceive, the ones in this room who are not daltonic. Okay, so he's the first cyborg, and there are more coming. Genetic therapies, there's a taste here. You can regulate bad cholesterol using genome editing, the famous CRISPR. You can also carry out corrections of diseases using CRISPR as well. And this exon skipping, you are cutting out part of the protein and you're keeping a part of it which is functional, and then you can correct the Duchenne. You can use stem cells for therapy, and those stem cells are now being used in cancer, in traumatic injury, in immunodeficiencies, very serious immunodeficiencies. And the clinical application of all these technologies is thanks to this man, Shinya Yamanaka, who was a Nobel Prize in Physiology in 2012, who discovered that, yes, 4 genetic factors were needed in order to transform both specialized differentiated cells into their undifferentiated cell, making them their stemness back again, and allowing us to transform them in virtually every cell type we need in order to treat different diseases. Okay? I had the privilege of listening to him when he was showing us the results of the Cell paper that eventually drove him to Nobel Prize in Rome in a conference. I didn't know in advance what he was going to say, but when he was talking, I told my neighbor in the room, this is Nobel Prize. Absolutely, no doubt about it. And indeed, he received the Nobel Prize 7 years later. So nanoprecision medicine, you have the possibility of doing a lot of things, not only with cells, but also with nanoparticles. You can build in artificially or assembling different types of biomolecules and also inorganic material. And with all these, you can treat diseases, allow the drug, the pharmaceutical compound to reach the target, and so on and so forth. This is a very nice picture. You have the different types of nanoparticles you can think about, and how they are being recognized by the different cell types. So they are internalized. All this is allowing us to synthesize new life in a way. Of course, we have to use the raw material we have in our hands, but yes, we can produce pharmaceuticals. So when I will say drugs, I mean pharmaceutical compounds. This is advice I have from my past life in neuropharmacology. But I asked for comprehension for that. So you can produce pharmaceuticals using genetically modified organisms, and these pharmaceuticals, I mean, these drugs can be also insulin. Insulin is produced by E. coli, modified E. coli. This is coming back from the 80s and the 90s. And you can also engineerize bacteria or algae to process a given pollutant, including heavy metals and plastics. And so to save or rescue damaged environments. This is done. Also to modify fruits and vegetables to resist pests, and also to modify pest-bearing organisms such as mosquitoes in order to counteract their ability to pass some diseases like the malaria. Okay. Here you have some examples of these here. Psoriasis, plastic, the synthesis of opioids by yeast, and the production of artemisinin, which is an anti-malaria compound. The discoverer for that also was the Nobel Prize Award in Physiology or Medicine. It's a Chinese researcher. Okay, 3D printing, another one of these techniques, fashion techniques, okay? You can now do whatever thing you want with 3D printing, okay? So you can, of course, use cells as your ink, and then you can produce bone for repairing lesions in your skull, or ears, new ears, or new phalange, or new eyes, or new whatever organ you can think about. So this is very rapidly evolving. You can not only produce respirators, as they did in SET during the pandemics, but you can also do many of these organs you can have here. Of course, the brain will take a little more time, okay? This is just a cartoon, okay? Robotics, so you know more than me, of course. The Da Vinci one, the Da Vinci was featured in one of the Mobile World Congress in Barcelona. It was a demonstration being carried out using Da Vinci, Jibo, which is a home one, Diva, which is a caregiver, Sophia, an involved one, True North one. You have a lot of things here. How you can apply these technologies, the ones that are affecting your brain, that are using ICT technologies, information and communication technologies. You can, for instance, you can use it for deep brain stimulation, DBS. With deep brain stimulation, you are inserting a pacemaker here. See if you can, well, I don't know if it's not working. Well, there is a pacemaker here below your shoulder, and you have an electrode implanted in a particular region of your brain, and in this manner, the tremors that are, for instance, very prevalent in Parkinson patients can be controlled, and eventually can be completely abolished. And in this manner, you can recover back your self-control and carry out a normal life. Deep brain stimulation has been used, for instance, for the treatment of a surgeon in Barcelona, Garcia Elias, who was featured in La Vanguardia in one newspaper, and he had Parkinson. He had the system implanted, and he has gone back to surgery. And he tells his patients, I have Parkinson. And you are going to operate me? Yeah, if you trust me, why not? I have this device here, and I can control everything. And indeed, he does. But not only that, a side effect, a positive side effect of this system, one person who was not suffering from Parkinson, but from OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, okay, you know about that a little bit, was also diabetic, and the treatment with DBS allowed him to improve the control of glucose, because there was a boost in the activity of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that in some manner allow to control better his glycemia. So sometimes you find surprises, okay? Prostheses, you have this exoskeleton, or you have this artificial hand. This is progressing very rapidly, as it is the brain-computer interfaces. And this is particularly relevant. Researchers from the Politècnica Institute of Lausanne in Switzerland were performing very well. They were publishing 2-3 months ago about the results. There's a friend of mine that is an alumni from this university, Pepe Millán, who's working now in Texas, also in this. I think you remember him. Well, you can't use your hands, you can't use anything but your brain, but you can control that in a manner to communicate, to execute orders, and so on and so forth. So last year I was told to have 5 minutes coffee break or restroom. I don't know if I can go ahead, or yeah, I can go ahead. But if anyone would like to have a rest here, we can, okay? So I don't know if there are any questions for the time being, or we are leaving the questions for the end of the talk. Now we have made this presentation, this panoramic presentation of NBIC technologies and how they have this power of transformation. And now we are going to focus on a particular technique, with this genome editing. And genome editing, you can look for its roots from, excuse me, yeah. Yeah.
More specific technology. You can comment this idea that you presented at the very beginning, that among other animals, humans are the only ones who have conscious cognitive, because there are other animals that prove that whales or elephants and some other cousins of us, like orangutans and big apes, also have developed some consciousness.
Yes, yes.
So because it sounds very anthropocentric to say that only the whole creation, all the mammifers, we are the only ones that this kind of cognitive attitudes as coaches. Be aware of oneself, be aware of the difference with another, and recognize the ones of our kind. The Christian already explained, that's the first cognitive attitude, to recognize myself and recognize the other.
The others, that's different from me, yeah.
So, and I believe that so that should be addressed in a more precise way, because other animals do the same, and they are not so harmful with the others, because one of the things that we are with that kind of consciousness is that we harm not only ourselves, the others, and the environment.
And the environment, yeah.
So I believe that should be very well treated.
Yeah. I mean, of course, any of these particular human features merit a specific talk. This was just a description of what are the main features of human beings. Of course, there are other animals and of particular vertebrates, and particularly mammals, and particularly great apes, who have also developed many features that are liking them very much with human beings. But there are specific differences in what human beings, how human beings are, let's say, displaying this self-consciousness. I just had this slide showing some of the cellular and molecular parameters or characteristics that are different in humans with respect to even great apes, non-human apes. But of course, there are many ways of dealing with these particular differences that are astonishing us a lot, not only for the goodness, but also for the other side, the negative things. Of course, this could drive us into another completely different class, but they are very, of course, very, very interesting. And I think that maybe we could have time at the end of the talk to talk, address them a little bit more. But yes, of course, I agree with you that there are many things we share. I think that could be the other one in another sense with our cousins or second cousins or third cousins, who knows? Yeah, and there are very intelligent or very smart, let's say, animals, not only in mammals or great apes, but also corvids are very, very intelligent, very smart, you know. Okay, so going to genome editing. Why I chose genome editing? Well, because it's much closer to my field, but in any case, because it's one of the techniques that is being particularly targeted by pro-enhancers, so people who would like to transform humans, you know, to make them transhumans, posthumans, better humans, improved humans, enhanced humans, or augmented humans. There are many ways. And also particularly transhumanists, because when you think that everything is in the genes, and then you modify the genes, thinking that this modification will make you better, then of course the modification, the engineering of our genome becomes one of the most interesting targets in scientific research. So things are coming from these two guys over here, Watson and Crick, who published this paper in 1953, which eventually led them to the Nobel Prize. And they were establishing the structure of how DNA could be replicated. So DNA is a molecule, a nucleic acid, which is bring our genes, or the responsible for the transmission of our characters or features. Okay. This discovery started a series of discovery, a series of techniques in order to know better the structure, know better the function, and also to modify nucleic acids. Very soon after, two scientists were the first ones to synthesize nucleic acids. Severo Ochoa, RNA, and Arthur Comberg Jr., DNA. They were also awarded Nobel Prize. So immediately after the discovery, we start to manipulate it. And this includes human DNA, of course. No? And of course, one of the main objectives was to correct errors. Okay? So to know how the repair system works, DNA repair system works in cells, including human cells, and how we could take advantage of that or even improve it. And along with that came safeguards, an ethical frame in order to know how to use these techniques in several organisms, from prokaryotes until humans. And this, of course, for the sake of the environment or for the sake of human health. So, genome editing consists, as I said at the beginning of the class, in the modification of DNA, and this could be done in somatic cells, so mean cells that are specialized. You can find in brain, in liver, in heart. And the modification then will only be restrained to the individual. And it cannot be passed to future generations. And so the impact of this modification can be assessed in these cells, in this tissue, in this organ, in this organism. Whereas when you are modifying germline cells, the ones that are delivering the oocytes, sperm, or even early stage embryos, then the modifications there in the DNA can be transmitted to future generations, because these cells, or these cells have a capacity of either giving rise to a new being, as human being, or are able to produce any type of cell from its totipotent state, which is the embryo. Okay, here the impact cannot be readily assessed. Why? Because when the modification is being passed to a first generation, then to a second generation, to a third generation, and this you can imagine human, but you can imagine mosquitoes or flies or bacteria, and bacteria are doubling in half an hour. So, I mean, in one day you will have 48 generations. So, wow, this is a lot. It's difficult to assess because you are losing control of the modification you have introduced. Okay? We'll come back to that afterwards. I mentioned eugenics at the beginning, and eugenics was as a word coined by Galton, is a cousin of Charles Darwin, and at the end of the 19th century, and very influenced by the theory of evolution that was developed by his uncle, he thought that there were two elements. On the one hand, this ideal of progress that was very alive at that time, and how we could artificially improve. They were saying the human race. Race is not a scientific concept, I have to say. It has to be abandoned, absolutely. But of course, it's what they were referring to at that time. And also the belief they had that the improvement in the way of life, the conditions we had, was sort of preserving some of the unfit people to live longer and to reproduce. So there was a way of eugenics to counteract natural selection, which was not effectively running at that time, okay? And so in order to avoid the decadence of race, the decadence of a species, we should in some way select the most fit individuals. This is a little bit what eugenics is about. So the eugenic programs have started, public policies came, laws were passed, regulation was passed in order to favor the reproduction of whoever was considered to be fit, to be better, to be good, and to ban the reproduction of those who were considered unfit, less good, and so on and so forth. And this meant at that time mandatory certificates, birth control, sterilization of certain individuals or groups, and this was applied to people with Down syndrome and people with some cognitive impairment, driven diseases, some particular individuals of certain races, drove to eugenic abortion, immigration control, and access to education. So this was present in many Western countries until the first third of the 20th century. So it's a little bit unknown, but it's there. I mean, you can dive into it. And when, after the Second World War, there was established a much more concern on the ethical limits of scientific research. This is the famous Nuremberg trials, the Nuremberg Code, and so on and so forth. And also the development of these techniques of modification of the DNA that I explained before, after or further to the discovery of DNA structure and function by Watson and Crick. So this development of the techniques drove to the first attempts of gene therapy, and also with the implementation of the in vitro fertilization techniques. Unfortunately, these first attempts of gene therapy were unsuccessful because some of the people, the subjects treated, died. So they were stopped. And more about the same time, we had this concern of many scientists, that I will come to that afterwards. But at the same time, at the end of the 20th century, beginning of this century, we had this neoliberal eugenics. So the, in a way, many of individuals, many persons were thinking that individual decisions should be, let's say, liberalized, should be made freely, and allowing people to determine himself, herself, and their offspring as well. With these modifications that were prone to eliminate illnesses or to attain a desired trait. Could be this intelligence, this longevity, or memory, or speed, or muscle strength, or others. So now we are facing is more Orwellian-like society, a dystopic society, if the application of these techniques is being done without an ethic control. And of course, without the respect for individual human rights. So, as I was about to say before, scientists are not brainless, or they are concerned about what we do and how things could be done better. So in 1975, so this is 22 years after the publication of the Nature paper by Watson and Crick, the techniques of modification of DNA were so evolved that allowed to modify even human DNA, human genome. So they met in Asilomar. Asilomar is a resort in California, by the sea, and they met. They were very young. Some of them are still alive. David Baltimore or Paul Berg, and they also met with some lawyers, some medical doctors, how to establish some guidelines to safely modify or engineer DNA. And they came up with a paper in Science, which was delivering some of the main ideas, which is basically moratoria in the application of these techniques in a way that was not controlled. So first, we should be sure that we are not posing an additional risk to human subjects. And so before using that, they call recombinant DNA, we should carry out a lot of preclinical trials before. Okay, so let's say safeguards, prudence, controls before attempting a generalized use. Of course, this was not jeopardizing whatsoever what is one of the main milestones, which is the publication of the human genome, which is another consequence of Watson and Crick paper. This was published, the first draft in 2000. It was published by two different groups, one public and one private. The guy in the left-hand side is Venter, which was leading the private one. The guy on the right-hand side is Francis Collins, which was NIH director until some months ago. They published at the same week in Science and Nature, and thereafter you think, well, then thing was over. We know everything. No, we know just a part of it, because only last month the most complete human genome was revealed, a telomere to telomere sequencing. So now we know better. We have a 2022 draft. And in this manner, we know better not only the coding, but also the non-coding regions of DNA. So this is still a long way. Which techniques do we have now which are allowing us to modify DNA and eventually to go to genome editing, genome engineering? You have these techniques, TALEN and zinc finger nucleases, which are allowing us to insert, to delete, to modify our DNA. And they are working with DNA binding domains. And without any doubt, the most striking technique is CRISPR. And CRISPR is using a RNA guide, which is driving a particular nuclease, which is the Cas, and allows the insertion of a particular sequence using also the DNA repair system of the cell. The other techniques were good, but were not so efficient, they were not so precise, they were difficult. They were difficult in a, let's say, technical point of view. Whereas CRISPR is much more handy, much more efficient, much more easy to use by any lab, okay? So indeed, we have the so-called the molecular scissors. We can do whatever thing we want, but still we are at risk of off-target effects, so not modifying the right place we are looking forward to. We can also have unintended effects in the target, and so on and so forth. So it's still a long way. Notwithstanding, the two winners are here, Emmanuel Charpentier in the right, and Jennifer Doudna in the left, French-American. They were awarded Nobel Prize in 2020, well deserved. For us, as Spanish researchers, we would have liked to see also Francis Mojica, who was the discoverer of the CRISPR sequences, but the Nobel Prize Committee decided not to include him here. They were the first ones, but there were other, let's say, front runners with them. But of course, the winner takes it all, as the song says, okay? Well, nevertheless, they well deserved. So, after CRISPR, is there a life after CRISPR? Yes, we have other techniques, base editing. So you can substitute a base. You know, a base is the each chain of our nucleic acid, okay? You can change a base which is wrong for another way, for another one, which are breaking the double-strand DNA, or you can also use the prime editing. So you can copy in a direct manner. Of course, these techniques are still being developed. They have not clinical application, but they will reach the market very, very soon. So again, scientists are not brainless, I said before. They decided to meet again. But this time they went to the vineyards of Napa Valley, also in California, and they gathered lots of other professionals, not only molecular biologists, but also medical doctors, ethicists, philosophers, lawyers, and so on and so forth. And there, again, they published a paper in Science, as they did in 1975, with these recommendations. Not to carry out clinical application for the time being, education, so to disseminate what this technique is about. This talk could be also an example of that. More research in human and non-human models, and also to carry out other meetings in order to progress in how we are dealing with these techniques. These meetings have taken place. This is in the first Human Gene Editing Summit, was in December 2015. And this, regardless this broadened path, some scientists apply for permits in order to use CRISPR to modify the genome in human embryos, but without being allowed to go further into the delivery of a baby. Okay? They have to use it within the 14 days frame that is allowed in human embryo research. However, there are many applications of CRISPR that could be used. You can use in vitro, you can use in cells, you can treat different diseases, like sickle cell, Huntington's disease, several cancers. You have a lot of clinical trials underway. The majority of them are in cancer, for treating particular resistant cancer diseases. But also, there are other people that are carrying out research without taking into account the guidelines that were agreed in Napa. And these are these guys in China. They edited human zygotes without being clear how they did that, in order to treat a particular disease called favism, which is a somatic-driven disease. But they were not very successful, let's say. They did not. And also they did that with the beta thalassemia, which is a blood disease, and they make also a partial correction of the disease using CRISPR and in DNA of human embryos. Other researchers carry out their work in a much more controlled manner, just this guy over here, even though some scientists say that we have to still increase efficiency and precision. But then we reach to this guy, I think you know him, Hu is a Chinese biotechnologist who carried out a clinical trial without honoring the rules of clinical trials and misguiding people when he was recruiting the couples to participate in his study, and not telling the truth, basically, using a fake informed consent, and so on and so forth. This man was given the award in the second Human Genome Summit, which took place in Hong Kong, and in 2018, and he was very heavily criticized by the same researchers that met in Washington and had met in Napa Valley. Okay? He has never published the results. We know that two girls were born, Lulu and Nana, that one of them had completely corrected, was completely successful, the modification in her genome, but not in the other one. And there's a third one, whom I don't know the name, who was born afterwards. This man was being prosecuted by the Chinese government, was being convicted, and was being put in prison. He has been released, but I don't know. He has shown up because there are no pictures. Okay. So this prompts our interest in a better handling of how we use these techniques in order to be applied in clinical use, so in human beings. Because otherwise, then we are reaching these situations which are not our target. So, for instance, World Health Organization asked to have a global registry for all CRISPR experiments carried out in human beings. And this will, in certain manner, at least allow us to monitor what is being done elsewhere. Okay? If you do things correctly, you can cure this, many diseases that are very difficult to treat. This is a cancer that is being treated with TALEN, one of the techniques. The other one on the other side is with zinc finger nucleases. It's a metabolic disease. You can use CRISPR also to for immunotherapy in cancer, and you have a lot of clinical trials being carried out now, the majority of them on cancer. So you can author the genome of several organisms, but you should assess short and long-term impact in the environment as well, which is not so easy. When you are doing that in humans, you have to take care of respecting clinical trial guidelines, which are very well established. You can say they are a nuisance because they are require a lot of paperwork and so, but if you are adhering to the 4 principles I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, then you should follow the regulations of clinical trials. Otherwise, you are not going to get your therapy or your drug approved by FDA or EMA. Genome editing in human germline should assess the impact in future generations. This is very difficult to do, but we cannot hire ourselves away from that, because when you are modifying the genome of an individual, and it will stay in the individual, you eventually cure the individual or not, but things are left there. When you are doing that in the germline, whatever modification you are doing is going to pass over to the next generations. And you don't know how this will interact with other genes of the guy and with the environment. Do you have a question?
Yeah, sorry. I think about the human genome, when you were talking in the previous slides, there was the word modification in the germline can be transmitted to future generations.
Yeah, indeed.
Can it? Maybe, or it will be?
No, for sure.
Yeah,
if you are modifying the genome of any germ-line cell, you mean oocyte, sperm, or an early stage embryo, when it's completely totipotent, of course, this modification is going to be passed to future generations, because it has been already in the early stage of the new organism, and so it's in the genome of all his or her cells. Okay. Whereas if you modify a cell in a liver, only the cells in the liver will be modified. Okay.
I think it can, because to make a life, you need 2 cells. So if you modify one, it can pass to the baby or not?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, indeed, one of the if you are not applying the technique correctly, you can lack of a correct insertion of the modification. I mean, you can fail, but of course, this is a failure of the technique, but not a failure of the strategy. So the strategy, if you are modifying the genome of a germline cell, then your intention is to make this modification inherited by the offspring, by the future generations. And totally losing the original, well, it depends. It depends. If you are modifying the two alleles, yes. If not, no. Yeah?
Is it not better not to modify the genotype and, when the child grows up, he or she can decide whether they want to modify something in them or not?
Yeah.
You already said someone needs consent. You need consent. So what if the person grows up and maybe there's a mistake and then can sue?
Yeah, of course. These are drawbacks. These are drawbacks that are rising. We will come to them afterwards. But yes, you're right. You're right. The technique could fail, could not be 100% effective. Then, of course, you may or may not pass the modification to next generations. But if you do, the modification is passed, and it will stay. Okay, it will stay. So, but these are the drawbacks here. You have drawbacks of target effects. You don't reach target, you reach another target, another place of the genome, or then you have mosaicism. You don't modify all the cells. You modify one here, one there. This is mosaic. And of course, you can also have problems of delivery. If you are trying to modify cells in a particular tissue, in a particular organ, which is not reachable. Okay. So this is how it works. Basically, you are taking cells out of the organism. You are modifying them in the lab. You are making the modification using whatever technique, CRISPR, silencing, base pair editing, whatever. And then you are checking that effectively the technique has reached its target, that you have modified the genome, and then you are putting cells, modified cells, back to the organism. So in this manner, you have replaced disease cells with healthy cells. This is done, of course, here in an adult, as you were asking about before. Okay? So again, we have these two possibilities. If you modify individual cells in adult somatic cells, then the modification is not going to be passed to future generations, whereas if you are modifying cells of the germline, you are prone to modifying the genome in future generations as well. And this is a red line, well, in fact, it's red, a red line that is still being debated by the scientific community, whether we should keep ourselves on the left-hand side of the slide, or if we are going into the right-hand side of it. But if we do that, then we don't know which risks are we going to face. Yes?
So what are the applications in which you would have to modify using the gametes? For example, if someone wants to improve their memory, you can use the somatic cells and improve it. In which cases would it be preferred to go into the germline?
Yeah. Well, there are several diseases that are fatal in early age. So whether you make a modification at the very early stage, even intrauterine, or then the person will die very rapidly. Also, from the many diseases have consequences. So if the disease is making its debut, then there are a lot of negative consequences of the disease. For instance, you can have people with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. When they are very young, they could be even healthy enough, you don't tell the difference, but when the lack of the dystrophin is being established in that individual, then he is losing strength, not able to walk, have to sit down, cannot eat, and so on and so forth. So if you start your therapy at the very beginning, maybe you can avoid these negative effects of the disease. Okay? This can be done, as you were asking before. You can do that when the boy is still young. You don't need to do that in the germ cell line. But of course, you could if you wish. The problem here is when we come to transhumanists and pro-enhancers. They think that if you modify a particular gene, then you may improve the performance of the individual, having more intelligence or having more strength or with a better sight or whatever thing, you know. And the only way to guarantee that is if it can be passed to future generations. This is why I was mentioning at the beginning that their program is a radical program of transformation of humans into transhumans and then eventually posthumans. Okay? Then you can understand why they could be more interested in modifying the genes in germ cell lines. Okay? It is not only for therapy, but for enhancement purposes.
One question, the previous one.
Oh, yeah.
So you're saying that, well, this treatment is on individual cells when you're touching somatic cells, but if you want to have some impact on some illness, so what is the amount of cells
Yeah.
that you have to treat? Is that a lot or just few of them? Or?
Well, it depends very much of the disease. But, I mean, if you think that, well, let's be imaginative, no? So instead of making the kidney transplantation, you 3D print a new kidney. And then you use that kidney for this person who has an illness in the kidney. How do you build up this new kidney? You use the cells of that man. But if the cells are bearing a genetic modification that eventually can lead to a new kidney disease, you modify the cells and then you block this error mutation. You put a good copy of the gene, whatever thing should be. And in this manner, the new kidney will be a fresh, new, healthy kidney, but with cells from the same patient. So this is a way of approaching the problem. Other problems, when you have, you can modify cells of the immune system in order to recognize tumoral cells in a much more efficient manner. So you don't need a lot of them. You need a discrete number. You engineerize them out of the cell, as I showed in the previous slide. You put back them into the organism of the deceased person, which is suffering a cancer. And these new immunocompetent cells are much more efficient in fighting against this cancer and eventually eliminating the cancer. Okay? This is the basis of immunotherapy. Okay? Of course, there are many other diseases that maybe you need a larger amount of cells, maybe you cannot 3D print them or whatever. But I mean, the research is progressing very rapidly, so I think that we can, in the future, reasonably think that many of the diseases we have today could be treated with many of the techniques I have shown before. Okay? Okay. So we have already discussed about that, so I go ahead. So we have the techniques. We can use them for the treatment, for therapy, or for enhancement purposes. Okay? In one case, we are trying to balance, okay, equity. In the other one, to make a selection. The ones enhanced will be in the upper part, the ones unenhanced will be in the lower part. Okay? And this is artificially generated. Okay? So this is the ethical challenge. So if we are seeking therapy or if we are seeking enhancement, if we are trying to bring who's in a, let's say, less favored state to the state that she should be in, or if we are trying to push people who are healthy to a better condition. This is the point. And this is why Erwin Chargaff, which was a researcher at the time of Watson and Crick, and in fact, part of his work allowed them to formulate their hypothesis, say, there are two nuclei that men should never have touched, the atomic and the cell nucleus. And genetic engineering will bring much worse consequences than atomic energy. And of course, he's right. This could be the case. This is the reason why it's very important that we take into account what scientists discussed and agreed in in the Napa Valley meeting and the Human Genome Summits. Okay? Why? Because we cannot go from well-being to better being. These ethical issues must be faced, must be discussed. Otherwise, we are going to artificially create a society in which there will be part of people enhanced and part of people unenhanced. So it's not only that we are suffering a disease, we are healthy. But if you have not been enhanced, then you are in a worse state with respect to the enhanced people. So these are the concerns, the technical concerns, and also, let's say, anthropological concerns, the risk, the not correct success of the technique with these unintended effects, the changes passed to future generations, the risk of a liberal eugenics, that the potential benefits and harms are not being distributed equally, and the governance that is lacking, because otherwise we may have a country which is permissive and a country which is not permissive. And where will the researchers go? Guess where? So this means that these applications, particularly in human reproduction, should be addressed urgently. Going to the point, so we should like to be more intelligent. This is one of the pillars of transhumanism, superintelligence. So they would like these people to identify genes which are responsible of intelligence, that allowing you a better cognitive status. But the most recent studies say that there are tens, hundreds of genes that are connected with human intelligence. So the question, when you see these papers analyzing the genes that are responsible for intelligence, is which genes should be modified if we would like to enhance intelligence. 1, 2, 5, 10, all of them? We don't know. It's very difficult. I mean, if you modify one gene, you are already taking a risk. If you modify 10 or 20 or 40, all of the genes are connected. The expression of a gene is modifying the expression of other genes. You have feedback effects. And if you are doing that in the germ cell line, you don't know how these modifications in 1, 10, 100 genes will be performing in the next generation. So this is wishful thinking. So they don't know exactly what they should modify in order to enhance intelligence, or even to enhance your height. There are 100 or so of genes responsible for height. So very, very difficult, and things should be taken in a serious fashion, not just saying we modify the genome and then we become more intelligent. This is not serious, this is not scientific.
But do you think that it's easier to modify physical attributes of a human than like cognitive abilities?
We don't know. It depends on which is the feature you would like to modify. The point here is that many characteristics are not monogenic. Some of them are monogenic, but very few. The majority of how we are like is the result of the expression and the interaction of several genes. So in order to have a positive or good result, you need to modify more than one gene. So this is the reason why when we are carrying these interventions, we should take into account these things: safety, population versus individual. I mean, this is very relevant as well. The fact that spontaneous mutations can arise. For instance, if you are artificially imposing a genetic composition of the individual, this could lead to a reduction in heterozygosity and an uniformization of genes. So imagine that's imagination, okay? We find the gene for intelligence. It has been identified. We know it's gene whatever, okay? We modify that gene in a way that all human beings are bearing the same modification of this gene, which is driving us to the highness of intelligence, okay? So all human beings are the same, with the same gene, otherwise we are not respecting equality and justice, okay? But then one day, there is a virus-borne disease. This virus-borne disease is particularly targeting the modification in that gene that all of us has, and it's killing ourselves and it's killing human beings. This could happen. Extinction of dinosaurs, whatever you can imagine. So why, why, from the genetic point of view, why are human beings so successful in evolution? Because they are full of errors, full of heterogeneity. We are not all the same. We are very different. So if a particularly stressor, environmental stressor is coming, it's not going to affect us all in the same way, but each of us will respond differently. Some will die, but some will survive. If we are all genetically homogeneous, and there is something that is affecting us, all of us will be affected in the same way. So, the evolutionary process is selecting several genetic traits that are, of course, favoring the survival or the success of a particular human population. And as the environment is different here and there, sometimes the genetic constitution of a certain human population is different from the other. So we all know that Eastern populations, for instance, in China also, have less capacity of processing alcohol or milk. Why? Because they had not had a particular mutation in genes that are metabolizing alcohol and metabolizing milk. On the other hand, there are modifications in the structure of hemoglobin that is prevalent in some populations in Africa, in Central Africa, and this sickle anemia, of course, is very bad, but on the other hand, is protecting from malaria, this population. So the person who's bearing the mutation is more resistant to malaria. Why? Because evolutionary, it has been an advantage for that population to bearing that mutation. So it's not always yes or not, black or white. There are grays there. So we have to take into account also the grays. And we have also to take into account, if we are going to see human beings, the target, the subject of our modification. So you were talking about the infants or children who are suffering a particular condition, a particular disease, if they should or would like to being treated or not. So the best way to know that is to ask them. If you ask them how you would like to be in the future, tomorrow's children, you can ask Ruthie, who's depicted here. She's suffering albinism, so has 10% vision, but she overcome the difficulties and she plays basketball quite well. Or Mark and his daughter Juliet with Down syndrome. Neither Ruthie nor Juliet would like to have had the genome modified to avoid this condition they have, because they say we wouldn't be the same person. Is what they say. Okay. On the other hand, you have other cases, as John Sabin, who's suffering Huntington's disease, or Matt and his daughter Grace Wilsey, which are suffering a particularly rare mutation driven to a metabolic disease. They would like to have had this modification at the early stage, maybe in germ cell line. So you can have one or you can have the other, but you have to ask. You have to ask people, because otherwise you are taking decisions on behalf of somebody else, okay? So you have to rethink disability and preserve dignity. When I was referring before to the fact that if you are not enhanced, you are unenhanced, then you are handicapped, you are disabled. You are made disabled not because you lack, you have had a mistake in your genome, but because you have not undergone a particular modification in yourself. So this is the difference between what was happening in the past and what could happen now. Okay, this is what I mentioned. So there are several legal provisions here. Some of them are international, others are in Europe, so on and so forth. You can have a review of them, have a bibliography at the end of the talk, so you can consult them if you wish. And you have documents that are available online. Some of them are quite recent. And one of the most complete ones is the one that was done by the National Academies. It's a document, a very thick book, available in PDF as well, in which they are addressing these 7 points. So these 7 points have to be taken into account when you are examining the modification of the human genome. Okay? To promote well-being, to be transparent, to carry out due care, so to take care of everybody, not only of certain individuals, to carry out responsible science, so to respect the guidelines for clinical trials, for instance, not as who the Chinese researcher did, to have respect for persons, respect the dignity of everybody, to ask everybody if they would like to undergo a treatment or not, fairness to everybody, and to carry out transnational cooperation. So you have 3 different declarations of UNESCO that are pertinent for this, that they are readily available as well. And we come to the conclusions. I think it's time for that. And here we can say that in the last 150 years, we have seen a dramatic progress in scientific and technical inventions, with an increase in life expectancy. We have double life expectancy from the beginning of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century. And this, of course, is not only to thank medicine, but also to thank engineering. Why? Because, as you remember from one of my first slides, one of the first lackness is the lack of sanitation. And sanitation is a clear result of the action of engineers. Okay? So to drill a well, or to keep water in conditions of to drive water until houses. Okay? So there's a lot of things to discuss about, but it's a interdisciplinary thing. Yeah?
But are these numbers global from 40 to 80, or it's specific to developed countries?
No, this, you are right, it has a bias. This is in Western countries. Okay, particularly in Western countries. You are right. Okay, so if we apply the NBIC techniques or technologies, emerging technologies, not only for therapy, but also for human enhancement purposes, in order to make people happier, more intelligent, live longer, is this correct? Is this right? Will this drive to a better society in the future or not? We have many dystopic books and films to think about, but also the reality of human history. I think you mentioned before that, the person asking that he's no longer here, if all this singularity of humans has not only driven to success, but also to harm each other. And indeed, very often it's the case, as we can see every day in the news. Okay? It's interesting, it's worthwhile to preserve our genetic heritage, or should we allow artificial social inequalities? This is a pertinent question too. So not only with genome editing, but also with other techniques we can use, we can apply. So this is a question we should at least discuss. If we use genome editing in the human germline, we are going to face problems. These problems must be known, must be discussed, must be taken into account, because maybe there is no way back. And of course, whatever thing we do, it should be agree a wide consensus. And this consensus means international, not only in a particular region of the world. So I think that I tried to give you this picture of how we have these NVIC technologies, how we can use it for the sake of human progress, of human health, and which are the perils, the risks, if the technology, particularly in genome editing, is not applied, taking into account all the factors that should be taken into account, not only the ones we like, but also the ones we dislike. And with this, thank you. And as Jordi mentioned before, these are pictures from the first book, which is this one that is available. And I think you have the bibliography here. So you have the different documents that I showed in the slides before, and some publications that are mentioned here and there. So you can, some of them are, as you see, there is the link. You can download it very easily. So I can take more questions if there is time, if the organizer thinks there's time. I was told that we have time until 2 p.m. So, yeah? Future generations.
Exactly. Then, and I see this biotechnology, this government as a correct this kind of problem. Of course, some institutions react in negative way, and it opposite argument that these studies are not ethic because modify the
Well,
What do you think about this, your personal belief?
yeah, well, I can understand you. You are, in a certain way, depicting the debate between bioconservationism and techno-optimism, okay? And as I said before, I think I said that before, we are not in a black or white, but we are in a gray tone. So it's not that we should all be on one side or on the other side, and then we have to tirarnos los trastos, no? To fight against each other. No, no, no. The problem here is that not always the new technique is going to be always driving us to a better situation, end situation, is going to cure a disease or is going to provide the desired trait. This could be the case or could not be the case. It depends. It depends on how the technique is being used, where is it going to be applied. Okay? Example. One of the brain regions which is responsible for spatial memory is the hypothalamus. They carried out a nice study by brain imaging, and they were able to determine the thickness of the layers on the hypothalamus of taxi drivers in London. So taxi drivers in London had to pass a test in order to demonstrate that they knew how to drive in London. So I had to remember which street to take, where to go, and so on. So it had a very good spatial memory. Do you think that now, with the coming of smartphones, taxi drivers will perform as well as they did? For sure not. How many of you can tell from your memory a telephone number? You can do a test. You write down in a paper, telephone number, daddy, mom, friend, whoever. I can write several, but they are, let's say, fixed numbers, not mobile. Mobile numbers I can remember very little. Why? Because we rely on technology. So we give all our memory to a machine, a device. So in a way, we are depending on this device to perform better. Is this an advantage or a disadvantage? It depends.
In fact, for the technology, we do certainly abilities.
And we,
And improve another one.
yeah. But I mean, it's not that it's only and always good and positive. There are things that are improving, that are better, others, maybe they are not. So, if you are modifying a gene, thinking that the modification will improve, you have to test, you have to demonstrate that. It's not just wishful thinking. You have to demonstrate that in a very specific manner, such as the clinical trial guidelines say. If you demonstrate that you are bearing goodness, that you are improving, that you are providing something positive, then you are going to be allowed to use that. If there are drawbacks, if there are negative side effects, you are not going to be allowed. And this happens all the time in the regulatory agencies. So this means that not always the technology is driving us to a better situation. It depends. It depends very much. It depends not only on the market, which is one driver, but also on the individual and the health of society. If you are introducing a modification that is bringing social inequalities artificially, you should think carefully before if it's worth doing that or not. So this is very clear. Of course, we don't have to be a radical bioconservationist or radical techno-optimist. I think we have to examine the issues from a very rational point of view and decide upon. Depending on the situation, depending on the technique, depending on the person. Okay? Of course, the majority of techniques are for the goodness of the human population, but not always is the case, or they are not being applied appropriately. Okay? Yes?
So I have a few points on this issue. First one is, as you mentioned in the slide, one of the very famous authors mentioned that the human should not touch an atomic cell and a human nucleus because it is very much possible for this to become a weapon in the future, biological weapon, as they will modify humans in armies and make them stronger, things like that. Secondly, why don't we focus on just treating the humans and removing their illnesses instead of enhancing them? I think the main focus should be on treating, for example, cancer, disabilities, cognitive abilities, instead of enhancing, because like you said, you create like a class of humans which would be superior to the people who have not been enhanced. I forgot the third one, but maybe you can just share your views on the first.
Yeah, well, indeed, you are right. I mean, the goal you are pursuing is going to drive your behavior. So if you think that your role is to treat a disease, to find new therapeutic tools, to make them work efficiently and safely, okay, no problem at all. On the other hand, it's more than welcome. The problem here is that when you're relying much on your individual point of view, thinking what is good, what is bad, and then you're stating that as a sort of a standard, a new standard you should reach, and then if you do not apply these techniques to yourself, you are being left behind. So the difference here is on the concept you have on human nature. So if you think that humans, as we are, merit some type of respect, protection, then you will appreciate how we are like, with our defects and with our errors and with our likenesses and whatever you think. If you are unsatisfied with the evolutionary process and you think that with all the techniques we have, we are allowing a lot of unfit people to survive, as Galton was telling at the end of the 19th century, and in that situation, you will apply at least an eugenic strategy, because it's a consequence of this way of thinking. It's contrary to what you just mentioned. But this
Consequences desirable. For example, you mentioned that life expectancy can be increased through these techniques. Is it desirable for the human?
yeah, it has been increased.
150 years.
It has been increased. Yeah. Of course. I mean, apart from drinking water, you can have antibiotics, which are one of the few drugs that are actually cure. Some of them they are not. There are several inventions, several discoveries that have meant a clear step forward in the well-being of humanity. Yes, indeed. We have to be open to progress, open to future, but we cannot shut our eyes on an equal use of technologies.
First of all, thank you for the sharing your knowledge. Before we were discussing the point of that one of the problems of changing the genome could be that we will be all the same, and then we can be all affected by a sickness, and this could be a big problem. And this is exactly what happened with the agriculture and with
GMOs.
genetic modification in agriculture. And maybe it's not your expertise area,
Modified
food,
organisms.
Yes, in processed food and whatever. So, and how, if I'm not sure, maybe you know how all these modification, first of all, like one point interesting is that there is not the same discussion about ethical consequences or ethical issues in this agriculture than in human modification. Of course, but not so, maybe it's not so obvious because at the end we all eat this food and this can also have a consequence. It can also somehow modificate. And I want to know if
Yeah. Well, GMOs in food is also could be also a concern. However, the modification of a specific vegetable species that are used for human consumption is more, let's say, no longer a technical problem, but maybe it could be a commercial problem. So if you have to buy this modified seeds from your supplier, and you cannot, you have to keep always buying the seeds, otherwise you cannot grow your crops. This is not a biological problem. This is a commercial problem. And in this case, other laws should be enforced. Regarding the risks that could be posed to human health, I mean, there is a very good researcher that is on the other side of the street, Pere Puigdomènech, who knows a lot about that. He's in the CSIC, working here in GMOs. And I mean, yes, you may have, maybe if you are eating a GMO, you may become allergic to a new protein you have never been exposed to before. Yeah, but this can happen all the time with many other products you can find from the industry. So the risk in terms of human health of eating GMOs is really very low. It's not a real problem. The problem could arise because there is a lack in biodiversity. This, yes. Here we can have a problem. Yeah, it's a current concern. Yeah, it's a continuous process, yes. We have the technology in order to try to keep up with these possible stressors, environmental stressors, so trying to make our crops better, to produce more, to be healthier, and so on and so forth. This you can do with technology all the time. But you rely on the technology, you rely on the supplier, and you lose heterogeneity, of course. I mean, in the past, there were hundreds and hundreds of different variants of pears, apples, and so on. Now, you have very few types of fruits in the market because the other ones are not commercially relevant. They are not interesting. Is this positive or is this negative? Well, it's not so easy to say because if you are improving the efficiency of the crop, then you are able to feed a larger population. If you instead of one type of wheat or corn, you have hundreds of them, you cannot reach the whole population, maybe. I don't know. I'm not an expert in the field. But of course, it's clear that losing heterogeneity is a risk. And this is the reason why they are keeping seeds in global repositories, such as the one they have in Norway. If they are doing that, there is a reason. I mean, they are not doing that for fun. It's not just a museum, because I don't think there are visitors going there. I don't think so. But in any case, there is always a drawback. When you are being sold a new technology as, change your mobile phone, take this new one because it's better and it's going to allow you to do this and that and the other thing. Or access to this web page, use this app, it's free, it's free, it's free. When something is free, they say you are the price. So always be very critical. Examine the subject from a critical point of view, apply a rational analysis, see if it is solidly based on scientific grounds, what they say, that they are not selling smoke, that they are selling something that is well demonstrated, that is not harmful, that is delivering the effect they intend to deliver, that you can control what is going to happen, and so on and so forth. This is the reason why I am particularly against crossing the red line from using genome editing techniques in adults, in somatic cells, and that to use them in a way that you're going to modify the genome in a way you cannot go back. This is my main concern. Say, well, but if you can demonstrate you that this can be done in a safe manner and so on. Nobody can demonstrate that. I mean, it's telling a lie, or telling something you cannot demonstrate. So you have to say, very humble, I don't know. I don't know. I have the desire, I have the ambition that this is not going to be harmful, but I really don't know. I cannot give you guarantee, 100% guarantee that this is going to be in that manner and not in the other one. And we have examples in the past that a particular technology that was conceived in a way has been used in the contrary and has been revealed harmful at the end of the day. So, not to be techno-skeptic or against bioconservationism, try to balance things. I always say try to see what is good and try to see what is not so good, but apply to the specific issue, to the specific problem. Because maybe sometimes a particular technology could be acceptable in a particular context, but not to be exported to the whole population. So this is how I think, how I see these things.
Okay, so if there are